Two women scarred by the past. One Valentine's Day. A love they weren't sure they deserved, until they risked everything to find it. Helen Stewart stepped out of the prison gates, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of her worn coat. The air was different outside, sharper, colder, louder, and she hated it instantly. Freedom was supposed to feel like relief, but instead, it felt hollow, as though the city itself resented her. Every footstep echoed too loudly against the pavement. Every distant honk of a car reminded her of locked doors, concrete walls, and nights spent listening to someone else's breathing. She had survived worse. That was the mantra she repeated like a shield, but it didn't make the quiet easier to bear. Her eyes scanned the streets instinctively, and for the first time in months, she felt the weight of being fully visible, fully vulnerable, and fully exposed. Somewhere across the city, Nikki Wade adjusted the collar of her coat and exhaled slowly. Her instincts had never failed her before, and now they were screaming. A dangerous energy had returned to the streets, something she couldn't ignore. She didn't know why, not fully, but she felt it in her bones. Helen Stewart was back, and the city would never feel the same again. Helen's new apartment was modest, a small one-bedroom with peeling paint and a view of the river through a narrow window. She unpacked in silence, each movement deliberate, as if keeping her hands busy could stave off the memories that lurked in every corner. Prison had taught her to be vigilant, and the echoes of shouting, slammed doors, and endless waiting still clung to her. Sleep came in fits and starts, and the silence of her new life pressed against her chest like a fist. The knock at the door startled her. She wasn't expecting anyone. Carefully, she opened it to find a tall woman standing there, holding a package. Her eyes were sharp, calculating, and even in the brief glance Helen took, she felt exposed, as though this stranger could see the walls she had built around herself. Delivery, the woman said, voice low but firm. Sign here. Helen took the clipboard mechanically, but her gaze lingered a second too long. There was something familiar about the presence, something that made her pulse quicken. The woman didn't wait for conversation. With a polite nod, she left. Helen closed the door slowly, leaning against it, her heart thudding against her ribs. She couldn't place why the encounter had unsettled her, but it had. Nikki's life was built on walls. Invisible, fortified walls that no one had ever breached. Loss had taught her early that permanence was an illusion, and people stayed only long enough to hurt you. She didn't believe in attachments, she believed in survival, in control, and in keeping the world at arm's length. Yet here was Helen Stewart, a woman she had noticed before, standing uninvited in her thoughts. Nikki hated the fascination she felt. It made no sense. Helen had a past, a shadow she carried, and yet Nikki's mind refused to let her stay away. I don't do attachments, Nikki admitted once, under her breath, when Helen caught her lingering gaze. Helen's eyes softened, but her voice was careful. Neither do I. For Nikki, it wasn't the same kind of caution. For Helen, it was instinct, learned through survival and pain. But both women felt the magnetic pull, a dangerous energy neither wanted to name aloud. The first deliberate meeting happened in the most mundane of places, a small cafe on the corner of a quiet street. Helen stood in line, hands wrapped around a paper cup to chase away the chill, when Nikki stepped in behind her. Your usual? Nikki asked casually, smirk tugging at her lips. Helen raised an eyebrow, uncertain. I don't think we've met. Yes, you have, Nikki replied, cryptic. She dropped a small card on the counter before walking toward the door. Helen stared at the card. On it, in careful handwriting, were the words, "Some things are worth risking your heart for." Her chest tightened. She didn't understand why the words stung so much, why her pulse had jumped. She didn't even know the woman, and yet the card lingered in her mind like a promise she wasn't ready to keep. In the days that followed, Helen found herself noticing the smallest details about Nikki, how she hesitated before sitting, how her hands twitched slightly when she was nervous, how she smiled at strangers with an almost imperceptible softness. Nikki, for her part, watched Helen carefully. The way she flinched at loud noises, the way her coat was always buttoned tightly, the way her fingers drummed when she was lost in thought. They were circling each other, wary and curious, like two predators testing the waters. Neither dared to make the first move. The tension hung between them, quiet but undeniable, waiting for the moment when fear and desire would collide. And in that silence, both women knew something was coming, something that could change everything. The argument started over something trivial, a miscommunication about a mutual acquaintance, but it escalated quickly, fueled by months of unspoken tension. "I don't need you telling me what to do," Helen snapped, her voice sharp. "I'm not telling you what to do, Helen. I'm warning you," Nikki shot back, equally sharp. Their eyes met across the narrow space of the cafe kitchen, and for a moment, the world outside disappeared. It wasn't anger that made Helen's chest tighten, it was the closeness, the way Nikki's presence stirred something she had long buried. "I'm fine," Helen muttered, stepping back. But the lie stuck in her throat. Nikki watched her, hesitation in her gaze. "You're not fine," she said softly. "You never are." Helen swallowed hard, feeling an unfamiliar vulnerability crawl over her. She wanted to speak, to admit things she had buried for years, but fear held her tongue. "I'll survive," she said finally, not looking at Nikki, but inwardly she wondered if survival alone was enough. The next week, Nikki began keeping her distance. She stopped returning Helen's calls immediately, canceled lunch plans at the last minute, and smiled politely from across the room without lingering. Helen noticed everything. Every canceled coffee, every delayed message, every brief glance. Her stomach knotted in confusion and hurt. She wanted to confront Nikki, to demand honesty, but the same walls she had carried from prison prevented her from acting. Fear whispered that reaching out would only lead to disappointment. Meanwhile, Nikki wrestled with her own instincts. She knew that keeping distance was the only way to protect herself. But every time she saw Helen's eyes, wary yet searching, something inside her ached. She didn't know how to bridge the gap without losing control, and she wasn't sure she wanted to. Helen's nights were plagued by nightmares. She dreamt of concrete walls, slamming doors, and the suffocating weight of confinement. The sounds of shouting echoed in her ears long after she woke. Every sound outside, the car horn, the footsteps, the creak of a floorboard, made her flinch. She hadn't spoken about prison to anyone. Not really. Not even to herself. And yet, Nikki's presence stirred memories she had tried to lock away. Nikki, too, carried shadows. Her past was marked by abandonment and mistrust, experiences that had forged a survival instinct she could never shed. Love had always been dangerous, unpredictable, and fleeting. She had learned to avoid it. Both women moved through the world carrying invisible scars, their own fears and desires tightly intertwined. And yet, despite the walls, they were drawn to each other, a pull neither could explain. One evening, Nikki broke her own rules. She confessed to Helen a secret she had never shared with anyone, an old betrayal, a wound that had shaped her life. "I've learned the hard way," Nikki said quietly, her eyes fixed on her coffee cup. "Trust is dangerous. People will hurt you if you let them in." Helen listened, silent, feeling the weight of her own truths pressing against the walls she had built. She wanted to speak, to share, but the words stuck in her throat. "I don't know if I can do this," Helen admitted finally, almost too quietly to hear. "You can," Nikki said softly, reaching across the table. "But you have to trust me first." The gesture was small, almost insignificant, but it left a mark. A crack in the armor. Helen bought a Valentine's card the next day. It was simple, white, no glitter, no clichés. She wrote Nikki's name inside, then crossed it out, then rewrote it. She held the card in her pocket for days, feeling the weight of it press against her ribs. Some things are worth risking your heart for. She wanted to give it to Nikki, but fear whispered louder than desire. She didn't trust herself to survive the possible rejection. Instead, the card stayed hidden, a quiet reminder of the longing she refused to name. It was late when the call came. Helen's phone vibrated across the empty kitchen counter. She stared at it, fingers frozen. It was Nikki. She hadn't expected to hear from her after a week of silence. "I need help," the voice on the other end was tense, tight. "Now." By the time Helen reached Nikki's apartment, her heart was pounding, not from fear, but from anticipation. Outside, the streets were empty, the city asleep. Inside, Nikki was pacing, her hands running through her hair, face tight with worry. "What happened?" Helen asked softly. Nikki hesitated. "Someone followed me. From my past. I thought I could handle it alone, but I can't." Helen's instincts flared. "Then don't." The night became a blur of quiet caution. Helen helped Nikki secure the apartment, moving silently, communicating in gestures rather than words. It was intimate in a way neither dared name. Her pulse ached when Nikki's hand brushed hers accidentally, just a second, but it left sparks that neither could ignore. When the threat passed, they sat on the couch, shoulders brushing. Neither spoke for a long time, but the air between them hummed with unspoken understanding. They could protect each other, even without saying it aloud. It was late when the call came. Helen's phone vibrated across the empty kitchen counter. She stared at it, fingers frozen. It was Nikki. She hadn't expected to hear from her after a week of silence. "I need help," the voice on the other end was tense, tight. "Now." By the time Helen reached Nikki's apartment, her heart was pounding, not from fear, but from anticipation. Outside, the streets were empty, the city asleep. Inside, Nikki was pacing, her hands running through her hair, face tight with worry. "What happened?" Helen asked softly. Nikki hesitated. "Someone followed me. From my past. I thought I could handle it alone, but I can't." Helen's instincts flared. "Then don't." The night became a blur of quiet caution. Helen helped Nikki secure the apartment, moving silently, communicating in gestures rather than words. It was intimate in a way neither dared name. Her pulse ached when Nikki's hand brushed hers accidentally, just a second, but it left sparks that neither could ignore. When the threat passed, they sat on the couch, shoulders brushing. Neither spoke for a long time, but the air between them hummed with unspoken understanding. They could protect each other, even without saying it aloud. The next morning, Nikki left without a word. Helen waited, checking her phone obsessively, until noon, until 2, until she realized Nikki wasn't coming back. When Helen finally called, Nikki didn't pick up. By the time they met in the evening, tension crackled. "I thought I could handle things on my own," Nikki said coldly, avoiding Helen's gaze. "I didn't mean to leave you out, but I did." "I thought you didn't care," Helen replied, her voice sharp despite the ache in her chest. Words were weapons now, slicing through fragile trust. They left without resolution, each returning to their own apartments, both stewing in hurt and frustration. Yet neither could stop thinking about the other. Helen lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every glance, every touch, every word. The silence of her apartment was suffocating. Every creak of the building reminded her of past prison nights, and every memory of Nikki left a hollow ache in her chest. Nikki, across town, was doing the same. She had spent years telling herself she didn't need anyone, and yet, Helen had quietly become someone she could not stop thinking about. The fear of vulnerability battled with the desire to reach out, to say everything she had wanted to say since that first encounter at the cafe. By the end of the night, both women understood something they hadn't before. Their hearts were tangled, whether they liked it or not. A shadow from Helen's past appeared unexpectedly, a man from prison who had never forgiven her, someone who wanted leverage, revenge, control. When he showed up near Nikki's apartment, Helen's instincts screamed. She called Nikki frantically. "I'll be there," Nikki said, voice firm but steady. By the river later that evening, they confronted the threat together. Helen's experience in danger complemented Nikki's careful strategy. By the time the situation resolved, they were shaking, hearts racing, but closer than ever. Nikki looked at Helen, a quiet awe in her eyes. "I don't know what I'd do without you," she admitted. Helen's throat tightened. "You won't have to find out," she whispered. But just as quickly as they had grown close, miscommunication and fear caused another rift. "I can't keep doing this," Nikki snapped one evening, frustrated and exhausted. "I can't keep pretending everything's fine when it's not." Helen felt her chest tighten. "Pretending?" she asked, hurt flickering in her voice. "I'm not pretending anything." The argument escalated, each word cutting deeper than the last. Helen stormed out into the cold night, slamming the door behind her. Nikki stood frozen, breathing hard, guilt and fear battling with anger and self-preservation. Both knew that if they didn't find a way to reconcile, the fragile connection they had fought to maintain could shatter completely. And for the first time, they feared the real cost of distance, losing each other forever. The morning after their fracture, Helen sat on her apartment floor, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. She stared at the floorboards, mind replaying the argument, each word sharper than she remembered. She hated how easily fear had turned into anger, how quickly distance had grown between them. A knock at the door made her jump. Hesitant, she opened it to find Nikki standing there, coat buttoned up, eyes softer than she'd ever seen them. In her hand was a small bag of pastries, Helen's favorite, chocolate croissants still warm. "I'm sorry," Nikki said quietly, placing the bag on the table. "For the fight. For leaving. For everything." Helen's throat tightened. She wanted to say the same, but the words felt fragile. Instead, she nodded, letting the gesture speak for her. They didn't hug, didn't touch, but the tension eased just enough to make room for something new, a quiet understanding. That evening, Nikki invited Helen out for dinner at a small, candlelit restaurant by the river. The flickering lights cast gentle shadows across their faces, making every glance feel more intimate than they intended. They talked. Really talked. Helen admitted the fears she carried from her time in prison, the nights she hadn't slept, the paranoia that still haunted her. Nikki spoke of her childhood, the betrayals and losses that had built the walls she now lived behind. For hours, they shared truths they had never spoken aloud, and with each confession, the distance between them shrank. When Helen reached for Nikki's hand under the table, Nikki didn't pull away. Their fingers intertwined, tentative at first, then firmer, and the moment lingered long enough to etch itself into their hearts. The night before Valentine's Day, Helen lay awake staring at the ceiling, her thoughts filled with Nikki. She couldn't sleep, every shadow in her room seemed to whisper reminders of what she had almost lost, of the vulnerability she was finally allowing herself to feel. Across the city, Nikki experienced the same restlessness. She had spent years convincing herself that attachment was dangerous, that love was fleeting and unpredictable. Yet here she was, thinking of Helen, feeling a longing she couldn't deny. By the time the sun rose, both women knew something had to change. They had to face what had been growing quietly between them, or risk letting fear ruin it forever. That evening, Nikki texted Helen a single message: "Meet me by the river." Helen arrived, coat pulled tight against the cold, and found Nikki waiting beneath the faint glow of the streetlights. The river rippled quietly beside them, reflecting their anxious expressions. "I can't stop thinking about you," Nikki said first, voice low and steady. "I was scared. I thought I had to protect myself by keeping distance. But I don't want to anymore." Helen's eyes glistened. "I was scared too. Scared of what I'd feel, scared I'd hurt you, or myself." They stood silently for a moment, letting the tension dissolve into something warmer, something more vulnerable. Then Nikki reached for Helen's hand, and this time, there was no hesitation, no fear, only trust. The first kiss wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a burst of fireworks or shouting declarations. It was quiet, careful, and reverent. Helen's hands rested gently on Nikki's shoulders, while Nikki's fingers traced the nape of Helen's neck. The world around them fell away, the cold, the river, the streetlights, even the past, all of it disappeared in that single, tender moment. When they finally parted, they rested foreheads together, breathing in the quiet. Neither spoke immediately. Words were unnecessary. They had survived darkness, fear, and distance to reach this moment, and that was enough. "I'm glad I didn't spend this day alone," Helen whispered. "You won't ever have to," Nikki replied softly. The night wrapped around them like a promise. And for the first time in a long time, both women felt that survival alone wasn't enough. Love was worth the risk. Valentine's Day ended without ceremony. No crowded restaurants, no clinking glasses, no grand gestures. Just the soft hush of the city after midnight and two women walking side by side along the river, their hands brushing often enough that it stopped feeling accidental. Helen noticed everything, the way Nikki matched her pace without thinking, the way she angled her body slightly closer when the wind picked up, the quiet attentiveness that made the night feel safe. Not thrilling. Not overwhelming. Safe. That alone felt revolutionary. When they reached Helen's building, neither rushed to say goodbye. "I'm bad at mornings," Nikki said eventually, voice almost shy. "But, if you want, I could make coffee tomorrow." "Bad coffee. But I'll try." Helen smiled, small and real. "I don't sleep much," she admitted. "So you won't be interrupting anything." Nikki hesitated, then leaned in and pressed a kiss to Helen's temple, gentle, unclaimed, full of restraint. "Good night, Helen." Helen watched her walk away until she disappeared into the dark. Only then did she allow herself to breathe. That night, Helen slept for 4 uninterrupted hours. It felt like a miracle. Love did not arrive loudly. It arrived in routines. In Nikki leaving her boots by the door without being asked. In Helen learning that it was okay to leave lights on at night. In shared grocery lists and quiet mornings where neither felt the need to fill the silence. They moved carefully, deliberately, two people who knew what it cost to rush. Some nights, Helen woke shaking from memories she couldn't outrun. Nikki never asked questions in the dark. She simply stayed. Sat beside her. Grounded her with presence instead of pressure. Some days, Nikki pulled inward without warning, old instincts flaring. Helen didn't chase. She waited, close enough to be found when Nikki was ready. They learned each other like languages neither had been taught before. Love didn't erase the past. It negotiated with it. One evening, Helen finally showed Nikki the scar on her wrist. Another night, Nikki admitted she had never stayed with anyone long enough to learn how to fight without leaving. Neither tried to fix the other. They just stayed. And somehow, that was enough. 1 year later, Valentine's Day arrived quietly again. But this time, Helen noticed the difference immediately. She woke to sunlight and the smell of coffee, better than Nikki had promised. The apartment felt lived in now. Warm. Human. On the kitchen table sat a small frame. Inside it, a simple white card. "Some things are worth risking your heart for." Helen stood there for a long moment, fingers brushing the glass. Behind her, Nikki wrapped her arms around her waist. "Still think that?" Nikki asked softly. Helen leaned back into her. "I know it now." They didn't make big plans that day. They walked by the river. Talked about nothing. Talked about everything. When night came, they returned home together, not as survivors clinging to safety, but as women who had chosen each other in spite of fear. Later, lying side by side in the quiet, Nikki traced slow patterns on Helen's arm. "You know," she said, half smiling, "we could have ruined this 100 different ways." Helen turned toward her, eyes steady, sure. "But we didn't." Outside, the city carried on, loud, indifferent, unchanged. Inside, two lives had found their rhythm. And for the first time, love didn't feel like a threat. It felt like home.